It's easy to think about this unit as being a little boring, but it's not. There are millions of intelligent processes going on in our body, enabling us to experience the world, going on in the background without us even thinking about it. And taking in the information of the world is what we refer to as sensation, our ability to take information in about the world. And perception is interpreting that information and enabling us to experience conscious reality in a remarkable place. So we'll begin with sensation. And I really want to encourage everybody to watch this TED Talk by David Eagleman about can we create new senses for humans, but there's so much more to it than that. It really gives you an introduction, like I certainly can't, into the magical mystery of the senses. And it's short and says some very interesting things that I think you'll find intriguing, like that the human brain is a kind of plug and play system. This quote down here is about creating the ability to hear through our back so that we can, so people who are deaf can actually, through a different kinds of sense interpretation, hear words the way blind people can interpret bumps on a surface and thus be able to read. So the idea of the brain as a plug and play system that would enable us to experience different kinds of sensation is kind of a cool idea. So sensation, once again, is taking in sensory experience. And we have a number of senses. Let me go over that really quick here. That we think about, and then a number that we don't think about. We have vision, sight, right, hearing, and then what's referred to as the chemical senses of taste and smell. And then the somesthetic senses, which are feeling senses within the body. Soma means body, so these are within the body, and we have the senses enabled by skin, including touch, pressure, vibration, temperature, and pain, or touch is the sensory experience. It includes these four dimensions. Thermoception is our ability to pick up temperature and feel temperature and internally sense temperature, right? So temperature regulation is going on all the time. We talked about that within us without us thinking about it at all. Another one of those intelligent mechanisms going on. Nociception refers to our ability to pick up through the hair raising on the back of our arm or neck with potential harm, which is very interesting, or pain. And then over here in the kinesthetic and vestibular category, this would be a good page to copy down or write because it, or print or make easily accessible when you take the quiz so that you can reinforce these ideas in your head. Vestibular refers to the inner ear, and there's a bunch of organs in the inner ear that you've probably heard of that are related to balance, location, and movement. Anybody who's gotten car sick or experienced getting, nauseated from motion sickness, or gotten dizzy knows what it feels like when those systems aren't working properly in the vestibular systems in the inner ear. And they also help us get a sense. They work with a very deep reptilian part of the brain called the reticular formation down in the R complex, up in the upper part of the spinal cord, lower part of the brainstem, that also gives us a sense of place, where we are in space. And then kinesthesia is about movement and our body's ability to move and coordinate movement. You can't see the little word down here, proprioception, because my movie screen's not big enough, but proprioception refers to our ability to sense our body position. And again, that's a combination of the inner ear working down here with the reticular formation. So you ever had that feeling when you wake up after sleeping and you're not quite sure where you are? Well, that's those mechanisms kicking back into gear so that we can figure out where we are. And it's interesting that the reticular formation is one of the parts of the brain that lights up more than usual with meditators. So that's an interesting thing since it's associated with our sense of place, and maybe with that expansion feeling that sometimes we get, expanded sense of place, that our sense of place is bigger and bigger and We're part of a great universe that people sometimes report feeling when they meditate regularly. Okay, transduction refers to the process through which outside stimuli becomes neural signals in the brain that result in sensation. So this is an electrochemical process, right? So it's simple. Just, well, the process isn't simple, but the term is simple, and what it stands for is relatively straightforward, is probably a better way to put it. You know, the information coming into our eyes goes through transduction to enable us to see. Going in through our nose goes through transduction to enable us to smell, and so on. And it does that through sensory receptors, and the sensory receptors in each of these areas work a little bit different. Okay. Cool picture of cats. It was recently Halloween. That makes me think of Halloween. Those cats with their glowing eyes. And of course, different creatures have different sensory experiences. You know this than we do. And it's interesting. One of the things that we become aware of in doing this unit is that we are a matrix that has a particular way of experiencing the world, and other creatures experience the world differently. This is one of the things that Eagleman really helps point out in the first video clip. Totally worth watching. Hope you did. Anyway, in terms of the light spectrum, you're aware of these different kinds of rays and wavelengths that we can measure, like ultraviolet rays, X-rays, infrared waves, microwaves, radio waves, but we can't see them. We have figured out ways of measuring them. And of course, earlier we weren't. This is the visible light spectrum that we can see. And perceptually, we see very little of what's out there in the world. You know, we have to pluck and pull. It's actually a limitation process to have a brain in some respects. You know, it has to weed out and enable us to focus in on certain things. Otherwise, we would be in a sea of chaos, right? So this is just to illustrate that, the idea that this is how the dog's view of the color spectrum, and because of the different kinds of cones they have in their eye than we do. And then the human cones enable us to see this much of the color spectrum. So we have the dog's view of the world and the human view of the world. And as you can see here in terms of sight, but of course in terms of the nose, it's a totally different story. There are some creatures that can see outside of this visible light spectrum, though, right? They can pick up on different kinds of senses, like snakes, all right, and elephants that can sense approaching storms. So this is a neat video on how other animals sense the world, just a different eye-opening perspective on how animal senses work different than our senses do. We're going to hone in now on the sense of sight and just learn a few things about each of these senses, right? Just expand a little bit. We're not going to go overboard, I don't think, even though it seems like there's a lot of slides. A lot of them have just a little bit of information on them like this, so don't be intimidated. I think we can get through it all in less than an hour, so let's dive in, and then I'll let you know which pages from the PowerPoint I think you want to kind of be able to get to or copy so you remember things. Okay, the eye, our vision, our ability to have vision is made possible by the eye as well as the occipital lobe of the brain, which is the back part. Like if you break the brain into 4 sections, the prefrontal lobes you're already aware of, those are in the front, and then we have the occipital lobe in the brain, and there's in the back, and that about a third of the brain is dedicated to vision. I mean, a huge amount. So a big part in the back of the brain here is, so every from the eye goes way back to the back of the brain to the occipital lobe. You can see that sight is a major sense for birds and hawks, and you know, actually humans have extremely good eyesight, and so do certain birds like hawks. But we do have very good eyesight compared to other animals. Here's the human eye, which transforms light waves into the world we see, right? And this is a good picture of the eye to go back to and return to, so that you can reference it for what the different parts of the eye do. I'm not going to go over these right now. We'll do it a little bit later because we have a video to watch on this. Light comes in, and then all of these parts interact to create sight. And you're basically aware of the iris and the pupil, right? The muscles of the iris right here on the outside, that colored part of your eye, those are actually muscles that contract and come back out in order to basically to control how much light is coming in through the pupil, right? Helps change the size of the pupil. And we have a lens inside the pupil that actually changes shape so that we can and makes things come into focus. I mean, this is like a brilliant, like we have camera systems, right? We'll just figure that camera system is just operating all by itself. And then all this information gets sent via the octave nerve here in the back. It goes through all these neural structures, and it's processed that way. There's more that goes on. We have the retina, which contains photoreceptor cells that enables us to see color in black and white. And then we have the octave nerve that comes back here. So all the way back to the back of the brain, the occipital lobe. And then we have this area of the optic nerve, that's our blind spot, is where we do not have photoreceptor cells that are processing light and visual images in black and white. They're missing right here in this little spot. So information that comes in right here is blocked from going because the optic nerve is taking up that area. So again, we have this word transduction, converting the stimuli into neural activity regardless of which sense we're talking about. Here we're talking about vision. So we'll see, here's the parts of the eye in a great video clip to watch that walks you through them. Strongly recommend that you watch that. And you want to pay attention to the words iris, cornea, lens, optic nerve, which takes it back to the occipital lobe of the brain in the back of the brain, the retina, which is light-sensitive inner part of the eye, okay, as you listen to the video. Those are the main terms to watch. And then these parts about the white of the eye and so on, we're not so concerned about. We're just focusing in on a few key elements. The visible light spectrum talks about, so you could pause the video here or go back and focus in again. Either way is good. So the visible light spectrum refers to the part of the light that we can see. And it's only a small part, obviously, of the electromagnetic spectrum. And our eyes, interestingly, just a few tidbits of information, because we're not going to overload. We're just going to learn a little bits of key insights, because we got to go through all the senses and then through our perceptual system. So we're just going to kind of get a basic lay of the land. Consider the football field. You're learning what the players are and what they do, right? But just the basics, so you can enjoy the game a little bit more. So weirdly, our eye actually sees things upside down. This is the image that comes out of our eye to the back of the brain, and it's flipped by the occipital lobe. Now that's weird. That's just a trip. It's just a trippy thing about what our brain does. I'm not sure if we figured out why it's that way yet or not. Even, to continue, right, our brain flips back and forth the left and right visual field. So you can see here that you have here in orange picking up the left side of the world from the left eye, and then in blue, the right side of the world from the right eye. And then it flips it around and, basically processes it opposite. Or maybe this confused me. But basically the bottom line is, I'm not sure if this image is projecting it correctly, but essentially your left eye information gets processed in the back of the brain by the right side, and your right eye information gets processed on the left side, which is just bizarre. And then they put together as an integrated images. So upside down and in reverse is the common language for how the eye takes in and processes information. And it travels through the octave nerve. The sensory data is processed and travels through the octave nerve all the way to the back of the brain to the occipital lobe. Back here is the occipital lobe part of the brain. So we're going to talk a little bit about rods and cones and a deer in the headlights just for fun. So rods enable us to see black and white. They're receptors for black and white, and cones are receptors for vision, for color. So you can see here that there's a smaller number of cones than there are rods. So it is easier for us to see black and white than color. And that's why people will have more of a vulnerability to going colorblind than black and white blind. But basically, one of the easiest ways to remember the distinction is that C on cones is for color. And this image shows you that light comes in, and then you have cone cells, right, that look very different, these green ones, from the rod cells that are processing the information. And this just gives you a little bit of information on some different kinds of color blindness. And if you think about the distribution curve again, you'll remember that these variations are, bound to occur. So we have monochrome. Mono means single. Well, so you have no cones, so you're just seeing one black and white images. Or you have red, green, so either the red or the green cones are not working. And this is a fun color test for you to play with. Individuals with color deficient vision will have difficulty identify the numbers or may see nothing but a circle of dots because the red and green cones are not working. So if you go back to the way the dog is seeing the world in terms of far fewer cones, far fewer color spectrum sensory receptors, you'll notice that that's how, that's some of the different ways that when we have less or when we have an abundance, because I don't know if you've noticed, but people can see color differently too, so there's going to be some variations. And it's the same with touch. If you take a certain section of the body, we're all going to have slightly different number of sense receptors in a particular area. So here we have sound, and sound tends to travel through waves like light, and their vibrations of molecules of the air that surround us have similar properties to light waves. So sound and light waves are often, are commonly mentioned as both using waves as a method of delivery of sensory or picking up sensory information. And there are different things, and you know this from listening to music, that the wavelength affects the frequency or the pitch, whether the pitch is high or low. The amplitude influences the volume, whether it's soft or loud, and the purity influences the timbre or the richness of the tone or the sound. Sound waves in decibels. The higher the wave, the louder the sound. The lower the wave, the softer the sound. If they're close together in time, high frequency, the pitch will be perceived as a high pitch. Soft, high pitch. Waves that are farther apart, low frequency, will be perceived as having a lower pitch. Ooh, these are the delta waves in our brain. Slow, deep sleep. Can't wake people up. Okay, sound waves that are too intense can cause damage before we actually feel pain in the ear. We don't have that many pain receptors in our inner ear, at least not at the initial levels of sound. Deeper in we do when people get ear infections and stuff. But so it's one of those things where we can hear sounds that are damaging to our ear, but we don't really feel the pain at the same time. So you can see here that we have a risk of hearing loss here, but we don't really have pain threshold until we get up to like the fighter jets really close to us, past the rock concert. So good to wear some kind of earbuds to those rock concerts. I know that you don't want to. So this is an interesting picture of the inner ear. There's obviously a lot going on in this inner ear, including these very interesting circular, spiral shaped, almost like a shell shaped membranes on the inside. And there's a lot of little bones, these vestibular bones here, that little particles go through. When people get dizzy spells and stuff, sometimes it's the particles getting caught in here and not flowing through here correctly. So there's exercises people can do to help them flush them out so they don't end up with vertigo and things like that. Cochlea implant enables, uses impulses to help. This is a implant of a cochlea. They're actually doing this very expensive, very invasive, very sensitive surgery because there's so many little bones in the ear and so on, but it does enable hearing, and it's quite something, a very powerful thing. All right, taste. It's the weakest of our senses at this point. For example, for our tongue, we have 10,000 taste buds, and a pig has 15,000, so half again as many. So they're the great tasters of the world. Gustation is the term that we use to talk about tastes, and there's 5 basic tastes: sweet, sour, salty, bitter, and umami, which is the taste that sort of like it's a savory taste that you often pick up in Asian food, for example. And this is a taste receptor cell over here, so you can see that there's different layers and dimensions of it within the tongue. This is the tongue. And then the nerve fibers send that information to our brain to be processed. Papillae, the tongue. The papillae of the tongue. Interesting close-up, huh? And these contain all the taste buds, right? So they're under the surface of the larger red papilla, where the smaller and more numerous ones. A touch-sensitive rough surface that helps us in chewing and moving food around the mouth. So there's 2 systems going on here. One that takes in the flavor, and the other that helps us basically move food around, like that you can move your tongue flexibly like you can move your hand. And now we move on to smell, which is our dog's great sense. You know, they're just shockingly good at the sense of smell. 22 million smell sensitive cells, 40 times more than us. I mean, shocking. And now we have synesthesia here, the idea of combining senses. That's what we're referring to when we talk about things like smell taste, that snakes can smell taste and so can elephants. That's combining senses. And so this video talks to you about that idea of combining senses and synesthesia. Some people, for example, can see taste as a color, like there'll be colors that show up and very interesting things like that. And now we're going to take a look at smell or olfaction. Now notice how quickly when we smell something, it moves up here to the olfactory bulb, and notice how close to the amygdala that is. So the amygdala is up here. So this close proximity of the amygdala and the olfactory bulb makes it so that smell triggers emotion and emotional memory, with the hippocampus really close to it, very quickly, right? So olfaction is the sort of formal name for smell and our capacity to smell, the sense of smell. Touch. Now, touch, like play, is a very powerful method of bonding. And if you want to be closer to somebody, if you want to build a relationship with somebody, find ways to play with them and touch them appropriately, ways that they're comfortable with, because some people are uncomfortable with touch, and you have to sort of slowly build that, you know, with a short squeeze of the hand, for example, that just lasts a fraction of a second. And, you know, maybe another time you gently put their hands on their shoulders for another brief moment, you know, and you gauge it based. That would be people who are touch phobic. But it's really good to, it stimulates, you know, immune system healing and stress reduction and all kinds of positive things when we have positive touch. And it strengthens social bonds, just like play does. And, you know, everybody likes to play differently, right? So there's lots of different play styles. We adults have a very flexible play style, doing stuff that's fun together, certain kinds of conversation or comedy, watching things. There can be, you know, telling jokes with each other. There are many different, you know, fist bump, when you have an achievement, um, sending each other jokes, right? There are things that make you laugh. There are many different ways that adults can play, and it's really bonding to play. So if you want to get close to people, up the play quotient, find ways to add a playful dimension into your life together, and see if you can incorporate more appropriate touch. And what I mean by appropriate is that you're thoughtful about what the other person that you're working with or interfacing with is comfortable with and what works for them, right? So here we've got a graphic of the skin. You've got sweat glands down here, pressure sensitive nerves over here, so we can pick up pressure, pain sensitive and touch sensitive nerves here. And notice how they look differently, kind of like Pokemon, right? Sort of. Hair follicles, picking up information. I've heard some indigenous tribal people say that they don't want to cut their hair because it's like a separate sense for them. They can pick up other people's movement and things like that from their hair. So that's a very interesting idea. Blood vessels carrying nutrients to the cells, layers of the skin. Okay, so we're taking in information, pressure, pain, temperature. We have these 3 sets of senses that are part of the somesthetic senses. Soma means body. And so we have the senses on our skin. We have the kinesthetic senses that is about movement and our body's ability to move, stay balanced, know where it is. That happens, knowing where we are in space is a combination of the kinesthetic senses, our body, like knowing where your hand is right there. Close your eyes, you know where your hand is, right? And then the vestibular senses in our inner ear that give us balance, right? So the kinesthetic senses use proprioceptive receptors located in the muscles, tendons, and joints to tell us where we are in space. So like I said, if you close your eyes, you can tell where your hand is, you can tell where your feet is, and that's because of these proprioceptive receptors. All this stuff going on, all this genius stuff going on, and we're reading a PowerPoint. Vestibular senses in our inner ear give us information about where we are in this larger space of the world. So you can see that this person is using their vestibular senses and their kinesthetic senses very well to be able to do this tightrope violin playing act. Motion sickness and is a disruption in basically the vestibular senses, which is inside the inner ear. And it can happen not just from being on a boat or in a car, it can also happen because particles in the ear get caught in here. Right? It's one of the reasons why they say don't use Q-tips, because it'll disrupt and send particles into the inner ear floating around, and they can get stuck or dislodged and cause vertigo. There are exercises, if you know somebody who gets vertigo, online to help move these particles through so that they can, and they're very, very effective at, so do that first. If you ever know anybody, go check out the exercise videos that show you how to manage vertigo. And try that first. So somesthetic senses include pain. And pain is, our ability to sense pain runs throughout all of our body too. Just like the kinesthetic senses, like if you close your, remember the whole, proprioception. This is annoying. Okay. Proprioception is the ability to close your eyes and know where your hand is, know where your leg is, and know where your arm is, know where you are in space, right? So that's inner senses within yourself that go to your brain, right? So we're looking at the same thing here when we look at pain. We have pain receptors, as you know, throughout our body. And people have different kinds and different amounts and slightly different, like some people will have larger concentration of pain receptors than other people. Some people have large concentration of pain receptors in certain areas, like the stomach. Some people have larger concentration. Some people have very low concentration of pain receptors, and so they don't feel as much. And some people, and it's very dangerous, clearly, if you can't feel pain, because pain is initially a signal that something's wrong that we need to take care of. So if you don't get that signal, it's a problem. And there are people who have the experience of not having that signal. So we have visceral pain, which is pain in our organs, like having a stomach ache or a headache. And then we have somatic pain, which is pain in the skin, muscles, tendons, joints, carried by our large nerve fibers to ourself, right? Like the proprioception cells that carry information about where we are. Close my eyes. Proprioception cells is carrying information about where my hand is, where my body is. You know, I know that I'm sitting on a chair because of that, right? And that's the information that gets blocked, by the way, whenever you go into a sensory deprivation chamber, is the proprioception information. And that's highly unusual. That's not something that the body is ever used to experiencing, is having those turned off, except when we sleep. So that immediately flips a person into an unusual state, because the body is dealing with something very unusual when those cells don't have enough sensory information to give feedback. All right, so we're back to pain now. Let's see, this is a really good image. So visceral pain, remember, is pain in the organs. And then the pain in the body sensation is somatic pain. Soma means body, right? So visceral within, inside, and soma in the joints and tendons within the bodily parts, right? Rather than the organs. And then, so what we're seeing here is mostly images of somatic pain in the joints and tendons and organ and ligaments and spine and the spinal structure, as compared to the visceral pain in the organs. And then the gate control theory is the idea that the pain has to pass through gates in the spinal cord, in order to be experienced, right? So that is one of the theories of pain, and it is certainly accurate. It's one of the pathways of pain, but it turns out that there's more than the pain gate theory. So there's more sources of pain than through the pain gates of the spinal cord. And so cutting down pain has been focused on trying to shut these gates, right? Controlling pain. All right, we're going to flip from sensory from pain now, to just some basic ideas about studying these senses that we talked about. And we're done going through all the different terms that you need to be able to reference. And I think you can see that in terms of the parts of the different senses. I think you can see that you can get a basic sense. You know, you can remember those ideas if you go over them a few times. So now we're going to look at some things that are measured in terms of the sensations. We have absolute threshold, which is the lowest level at which a stimulus can be detected. And, you know, this is one of the things that happens when you go for a hearing test. The doctor tests your absolute threshold and makes sure that it is low enough for you to have sound hearing. And then the recognition threshold, this is the lowest level at which a stimulus can be detected, but also recognized as a particular kind of stimulus. So, you know, absolute threshold, you're going, what is that sound? And then recognition threshold is, oh, that's the sound of somebody knocking or whatever. All right. So differential threshold is the level at which an increase in a detective stimulus can be perceived. This happens with the ear doctor too. This is like when they say, okay, can you tell the difference between this and this? That happens in the eye doctor too, being able to tell the difference between two different sounds, two different pitches, two different that are at two slightly different volumes, right? To see what the lowest, what the absolute threshold is. And then terminal threshold is when you can no longer hear a stimulus. So these are some of the things that are examined and, of course, help us maintain sensory health by measuring recognition thresholds and differential thresholds and things like that. And terminal means end. So these words kind of tell you, all of them have the word threshold in there. So that's how well you can hear, see, taste, smell, feel, or sense something. And here we have absolute, which is lowest level. Recognition is when you can tell what it is. Differential is when you can tell the difference between two levels. Okay. Does this sound louder than this or not? Right? Right? Can you tell the difference or not? Yes. Okay. And then terminal is when you can't hear it anymore. What's that level, right? Or you can't see it anymore, you know? And as our eyes get more tired as we get older, they tend to not be able to see it as well. So the terminal threshold changes as we age, right? So you can see how, and terminal, of course, means end. So now you can probably recognize what each of those are. Absolute is the lowest, you know, the first level that you can hear it. Then this one's obviously recognized. This one's being able to tell the difference. This means end. Can't hear it anymore or see it anymore or whatever. And sensory adaptation refers to how our body is always trying to help us adjust to something. I should put a graphic on here. So, like for example, if you put on your watch band and you feel it for a little while, or you tighten your belt buckle and you feel it for a little while, but after a while your body adapts and you don't feel the tightness anymore because your senses have gotten used to it so that you can focus on other things, right? So the body is busy doing tons of stuff so that we can focus conscious attention on interfacing with the world. And one of the things this graphic illustrates is that sensory adaptation happens with alcohol too. So basically, we become the flavor and we enjoy later pleasures less than the initial, right, amount of the pleasure. And you know about sensory adaptation to like coffee and things like that. Whenever we start drinking a lot of coffee, then we develop resistance. And it's because of the process of sensory adaptation, which is your body trying to help you function well, even with that stimulus to the best of its ability. Crosswired senses is synesthesia, where you have a blending of the senses, and it's a very interesting kind of thing. And there are people that when they work with numbers, they tend to see them in color, which is really trippy, right? Even if they are in black and white. And this video clip explores this idea of synesthesia, which is very interesting, helps us understand the brain to use people who have synesthesia and how they interpret the world. And there's different kinds of synesthesia too, as a kind of code for different ways that the brain can be wired, the variety of ways. And this, of course, also supports Eagleman's ideas about, you know, our brain is a plug and play device for different kinds of sensory processing. It doesn't mean, I mean, there's no reason to suggest that we have to stop with the kind of senses we have now. This is slow-mo, one of my favorite videos. This is a nice place to stop and take a break because otherwise you're probably going to have cognitive overload, right? This is about as much information. So really good way to work with your memory system right now would be to play this slow-mo video, which is one of the best videos I've ever seen. A short little LA Times or New York Times odd-ed piece. I can't remember which. This was a neuroscientist who's developed a condition called prosopagnosia, which is face blindness. And this sort of introduces us to the next unit of perception. It's a good way to start the next unit if you don't feel like watching it right now. And so what you want to do now is take a break and go do something else. Go do something physical, go do something fun, and then come back and re-review those slides. Maybe print out one page, the sensation page, for example, and as you go over the slides again, take some notes, right? Take notes on what the slides said. The next chapter, personality theory, that's a really good chapter to read. But this chapter, sensation and perception, the slideshow is pretty thorough, and you can use the chapter as backup. And so go back over the slideshow with a piece of paper. Use this page. You know, print maybe this page, and then you can print it in black and white, and then print maybe this page. Or take notes, you know, because you don't need to know a lot of these things like the aqueous humor, and the ciliary muscle, and the sclera. You don't need to know that. You just need to know the iris and the cornea, you know, from the study guide, right? So, and take notes on some of the key ideas, right? So you remember that the iris is these muscles here that contract and open and shut, that you have a lens inside the eye, that the cornea is the window in front of the eye, right? That's the pupil. Okay, so just get a basic sense of these parts. And when you go over that's another good one. So pick an eye one. And then I think the rest you can just take notes, basic notes from a piece of paper on the basics, like knowing that taste, another word for that is gustation, and it's called a chemical sense. And that there are 5 basic tastes, which you're already pretty familiar with, and that should do it there. You don't need to know where they are in the tongue. That's false anyway. They're spread all over the place. Okay, and the idea of taste buds and taste receptor cells, but we're not going to go into the parts of the taste receptor cell or anything like that. Okay. All right, I'm going to go forward now and keep going into sensory adaptation. You should know synesthesia, blending of the senses. You should know what that is. Prosopognosia, which is face blindness. You should know what that is. This is a good Psychology Today article about 6 senses, which, yeah, of course, because, you know, all we're looking at is what we've been able to measure so far. And our measurements are pretty good relative to this stuff, but we've still got a long way to go. You know, there's many things that we aren't picking up yet in this remarkable matrix world of ours. So now let's talk about perception, which will be a little bit easier than sensation. What do you see here? A vase or 2 faces? Which is it? It's both. And your mind can toggle back and forth between them, right? The idea that we can only see one of them at a time, we can't see the vase and the 2 faces at the same time, our brain has to pick one or other. That's the cognitive processing part. I mean, we just can't visually, our visual system, our eye and our occipital lobe are taking in the whole image. Now we've got to interpret it and decide what it is, right? And that's perception, interpreting and deciding what it is. So what is it? A vase, and you can only decide one or the other. That's selective attention. The idea that we can only decide one of them or the other at a time. And it's the same idea behind why you shouldn't text while driving, because the brain can do it can only focus on one thing at a time. Now, you're going to say, oh, I can multitask because I can wash the dishes and think about, my girlfriend and, and stuff like that. Well, yeah, you can. You can do some physical operations and some cognitive operations at the same time. But we're talking about attention, what you're focused. Some of that's just muscle memory, so you're doing it automatically. And some you can flip back and forth. You can flip your attention back and forth between 2 things really quickly. And you guys are very trained in your generation, which so many stimuli coming at you, to flip back and forth quickly between your cell phone and your work and things like that. But it does degrade focus to flip back and forth quickly, as you probably know. It's better to focus in some tension for blocks of time. And the other thing about selective attention is that, and the reason why you shouldn't text when drive, is that you should just flip that phone upside down and on the seat of your car. And it is because our brain can get seduced into spending just a fraction of a second too long looking at that text. And the fraction of a second is too long when you're driving. So that's the deal in the wrong moment. So that's why selective attention is why we need to not text when driving. Okay, Gestalt means whole. Gestalt. And the early Gestalt psychologists looked at how we as human beings, our brains are organized to try to structure things into patterns. We just have that tendency. And the first pattern and favorite pattern that we love to look at is human faces, not bicycles. But you'll see your mind wants to put these random pieces into some kind of organized structure. So from chaos to organization is the essential kind of tendency of the mind, and that's called Gestalt. Gestalt is the emphasis on looking at the whole, on seeing the whole thing that's there. Okay, so Gestalt refers to whole, and Gestalt psychologists started by studying perception and our need and tendency to look for patterns, and how our visual systems and perceptual systems are organized by default to look for patterns. So they have a bias, okay? And so they're trying to put pieces into a coherent whole. And one of the things that Gestalt psychologists will later then say is psychologically, sometimes we see patterns where there aren't patterns, right? So that's a phenomena of our tendency to look for patterns. So some of the ways that Gestalt started focusing was very kind of literal, looking at how vision works to enable us to make sense of the stimulation coming in about all this information that we're seeing about the world. And so the first thing, these ideas, these Gestalt ideas, started with how we visually process information. So one of the things, one of the foundations is the idea of figure ground, that something has to be in the forefront and something else in the background. And so is the vase in the forefront and the faces in the background? Are they the background now? Or are the faces the figure and the vase is now the background? And so the foundation of our perceptual system, and this is cognitively too. This is also with cognition. We, because the systems within us, they copy, they duplicate what works, right? So the cognitive system is also focusing on what's in front, and then there's background, because you can only focus on so much. So what are you focused on? And then there's all this stuff going on all over the place that you are not paying attention to. And that's background. So we have figure ground, the idea of figure ground, that there's stuff in our attention and then there's stuff in the background. And that's both visually as well as cognitively, right? So here is, a fantastic image that illustrates the Gestalt principle of looking for structure, looking for how can we find a whole and complete picture? How can we take this chaos? Is there any order out of this chaos? And our brain is just programmed and wired to do that, right? So here we're seeing, of course, by now you've already picked out the dog, because we have used this principle called grouping. That's what Gestalt psychologists named it, grouping. Noticing things that belong together, that group together, and watching them form an image that makes sense to us in our mind, turning chaos into a structure, okay? So here we have size constancy, and again, now we're going back into the idea of how our visual system uses perception to make sense of the world, which is really intriguing. I mean, if you actually took the measurement of this picture and put it right next to this man, it would be this big. But we know that this guy is the same size as this guy. And that's because of a principle called size constancy. Even though he looks much small, I mean, he's literally smaller to our visual field, size constancy is a perceptual mechanism in our brain that automatically operates behind the scenes so that we see this guy as being the same size as this guy without even having to cognitively process it. Ta-da. And shape constancy. Here we are. What's happening here is that we know that all these shapes are the same shape, even though they look different, right? They slightly look different. We know that they're the same. Now, you remember Piaget addressing this idea of shape constancy, and in particular, the idea of volume, right? And size constancy, that when something looks different, it's still the same, even if it looks slightly different size, right? So this is just telling us that we know that we know this is the same as this, even though it looks radically different. So that's just something, again, that our brain automatically does for us, and that the Gestalt psychologists labeled shape constancy. They notice that our brain has the ability to recognize that these are all the same thing and put them together in a single category of hat. This is the inside, this is the hat upside down, even though the shape looks very different in different settings. And then the brightness constancy, and that is that our brain sort of evens out brightness so that we see things relative to the background that it's in, right? So the whole background creates a shift in our perception of things, and the perception is influenced by the background. So you can see that in this image with the way that these colors look so different based on the background colors that are with them, right? You can see how the strength of how dark they look changes based on the background that they're superimposed on. So here are the Gestalt principles, 4 of them. We have, these are sort of basic principles, common principles, just like shape constancy, size constancy, grouping. These are more Gestalt principles. Brightness constancy, just holding steady our understanding of the image based on the context of the background. Here are 4 more, and they're pretty basic. Similarity is we see similar objects as being part of the same group, so we put these together. And similarity is one of the processes. These are all processes we use basically with grouping that helps us identify things that group or belong together. Proximity perceives objects close to each other as being part of the same grouping. As these pieces were ray spread out, we wouldn't see them as pieces of this dog. Closure, tendency to complete figures that are incomplete. You see that very well evidenced here. And contiguity is the tendency to perceive events that happen close in time together as being related. That's classical conditioning right there, right? So fear over the loud gong sound being close in time to the mouse, and we put them together. I mean, yeah, for little Albert. So here's similarity and proximity, okay? Similarity, proximity. So proximity, nearness, we put these together in clumps because of that. And similarity, we put them together because the lines seem to be going this way, and these lines this way, and these lines this way. And they're all black dots by, right? If we change the proximity of certain dots in the 2 examples, we experience the dots as vertical or horizontal rows, just by changing how close together the spacing between these. So here we have similarity of color, makes you perceive these dots as forming black squares, right? They influence the development of a shape. Here's closure, you know what these are, even with the little spaces in there. Continuity, we're much more likely to see the figure on the left as being made up of 2 lines, A to B and C to D, than we are of anything like over here, which is, or these, which is really interesting, right? Because of continuity following. So we don't naturally do this, and we don't naturally do this. We do this naturally even, right? Common region, we see 2 groups, stars and circles, similarity, but the common backgrounds are what give us a common region. Flags are all about developing common regions. All right, so that's how perception, these are just some of the organizational principles of perception. And you know what? This is a lot like learning about the mechanism of the eye, going back to the occipital lobe and flipping things from being upside down and backwards to the way that we see and experience them there in the back of the brain and so on, and that cones are for color. This is the same kind of thing about perception. This is stuff going on in the background. This is automatic processes, right? After the age of, say, 4. You got all these down. You know how kids know how to do these, right? They got size constancy, volume constancy and size constancy was a big thing that Piaget was measuring as kids moved from, say, age 3 to 5. Remember, with the shape of the cups? This is a really, and the amount of water that's in them, this is a really good video, very touching and moving, that sort of prepares you for a unit we're coming to very quickly, and that's disorders. And this is when the Gestalt, or making order out of chaos, and the system that we have, the matrix we're in that develops order out of chaos almost automatically for us. And we're just looking at a few of the ways when it dissolves with schizophrenia. And One of the commonalities of people with schizophrenia is they end up with some level of disorganized perception. And this video illustrates that. Louis Wayne was a famous graphic artist in the 1920s and 30s, and he did some stuff that's still famous on cats and some of the early caricatured illustration and cartoonish kind of illustration that were on magazine covers for many, many years. But he developed schizophrenia late in life, and he kept drawing, and you could see how, like, this is a picture of a cat, and his images are quite literal at the beginning, and then they devolve into, there's still structure and organization to this, but it's a far cry from what you generally think of as a cat. So you can, this is a artistic illustration of moving from organized to disorganized perception, which is a hallmark of schizophrenia. So this Necker cube, it's like figure ground, where you have a figure ground reversal, right? And so it goes back and forth and back and forth. And these visual illusions are tricks that are basically using knowledge of how our perceptual system is organized to find flaws and loopholes in it, like little blind spots, like they're in the optic nerve of the eye, so they can, you know, use, come up with magic tricks and things like that. So a few more things, but not much. Depth perception is the ability to perceive the world in 3 dimensions using cues, right? So that we can tell, because of these lines, the way the road comes together and converges in a distance. This is called linear perspective. So there are depth cues, and again, I want to point out that our mind does these automatically for us. It's complicated for us to try to figure out what our mind is doing. That's what's, kind of amazing about this whole thing. And here we have the figure ground, the same thing, where we have, the the large size of the pebbles here, small size, that lets us know it's further away, even though because of size constancy, we know this pebbles over here, even though they look tiny, are actually the same size as, or likely to be the same size as these, right? And then the idea of aerial perspective, that haziness surrounding things that are further away. When texture gradient refers to textured surfaces appeared smaller and finer as the distance increases. And here we have more texture, like it looks bumpier and rougher when it's up close. And these are just things that our sensory system and our cognitive system, well, it's behind our cognitive system. It's our perceptual system happening at a level even prior to our cognitive system that is interpreting this information for us. And now we're trying to interpret what our system is doing, right? Here's the atmospheric perspective, and you can see the haziness in the distance, which lets us know that that is distance. And again, these are all cues that our mind is, relative size is illustrated here. Size, constancy, same idea. Big flowers here, small flowers here. That looks really little, but it's the same size as this, and we know it. And then perceptual illusions, as we mentioned, use these kind of knowledge about how our perceptual system works and some of the sort of vulnerabilities within it, to including selective attention, because they keep your eye and hand busy here, and he's got something going on over here or somewhere else, right? So magicians use selective attention. That's their major one. And here's just some visual illusions for you to play with. This is called the Hermann grid. You notice anything in the white intersections when you stare at it, right? Those interesting little things that appear, right? And that's because of the way that the response of our neurons, kind of feeding back on this intense image, creates those for us. And this is the Muller-Lauer illusion. Are these lines the same size, or is one of them longer? Now, most people will sense or feel that this one's longer, but if you measure them, you'll see that they're the same size. And that's, again, a principle used in size constancy, right? Because you could see this as a corner moving towards you, or a corner away from you, far corner, near corner. And then here's the Miller-Lyer illusion again, near corner, far corner. All right, and then we have illusion we already talked about, I think, which is when the moon is high in the sky, it'll be perceived to be much larger on the horizon than when it's high in the sky, because of the way that our eye compares the size of the moon to this tree, objects around it. And this is the Ames room illusion. Because people expect rooms to be square, the tendency in this illusion is to perceive the boy on the right as very large and the man on the left as small. But the room is constructed in a illusionary way so that the left corner is far away compared to the right corner. So it doesn't seem like it, but this corner is way further away than this corner. And so this man appears smaller. So what's this? And this is, again, how our perceptual system, which happens automatically behind the scenes, can get us to jump to conclusions. And if we have certain expectations, for example, if I showed you a picture of 15 snakes before you saw this, the chances that you would anticipate and expect and label this as a snake are very high. All right, and that's related to perceptual set. And now we're moving into how perception and the tendencies of our perceptual system begin to shape the tendencies of our cognitive or thinking system, right? So this is related to the idea that, and this isn't that great of an illustration. Well, it's interesting. You can see a man here. You can see a woman, right? So there's a kind of figure ground illusion there. But when you look at the faces on the man, right, if you see a whole bunch of happy fake faces first, and then you see this face of the man with sort of that, and you're asked to rate what kind of face he's making, you're going to tend to see it as happier because you've been primed with happy faces, and it's opposite if you've been primed with unhappy faces. But maybe now, because I pointed out the woman, you're having a hard time seeing anything but the woman. But if you saw a bunch of negative faces and then saw this neutral face of a man or this neutral face, then you're more likely to report it as a negative face, right? And that's because of the cognitive perceptual sets that happen based on expectations, and expectations are based on prior learning or prior experiences that set the stage for our expectations or perceptual sets, which set the stage for confirmation bias, which is kind of illusion, right? Now here is a really good illustration, especially as we move into personality theory and we start to realize that we're all so vastly different in terms of our personality structures, because we're complex. And so there's lots of variables that can interact. And with lots of variables, we can have lots of interpretations of things. And here we got figure ground again. Are you seeing 3 or 4? This is a really brilliant illusion here, right? So half full, half empty is a classic example of the different perceptual views that we'll be looking at more in personality theory. And here you can see, some of the variables, just some of them that influence the lens through which the rest of the world comes in and comes out from us, right? So what is reality is such an interesting question. There's a great old phrase by Anais Nin: we don't see things as they are, we see them as we are. And there's a great old story of the 5 blind men and the elephant. And one man met an elephant, and what he learned about the elephant was his tail. And he said, well, elephants are long and thin and have a little bushy hair at the end. And another man who met the elephant and only saw his center said, no, they're huge and round, massive creatures. And another one who only experienced the ear said, no, elephants are thin and they have slender ears. I mean, slender, and they're as thin as almost like a piece of paper or a book. And another one says, no, they're long like a snake. And another one says, no, they have little nails at the bottom like your foot. I mean, what we experience influences our perception is the point of the story of the blind men and the elephant. And we all have different kinds of experiences. And because we're complicated, we've got things that are the same, but also things that are different. Every one of these brains is wired with neural connections like the trees you see outside, and they're all as different and varied as the trees you see outside. But we can do an awful lot with these hands and that variable wiring. And so now we'll be going on to personality theory to study variations in personality, and I look forward to seeing you all there. In the meantime, enjoy the remarkable matrix that we live in, sensation, and our ability to interpret it, perception. And please remember to watch these video clips because they're truly magnificent. They'll shift the way you think about the world. This one by Eagleman, they're short. This one, we're a matrix within a matrix, which is just a remarkable video. And I'll see you inside personality. Thanks, everybody.